Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
What's it like when you step into a world unlike any other? A fantastical, deeply personal, and strikingly unique journey. Crafted by acclaimed author Donna Minkowitz, her latest book, DONNAVILLE, is a genre-defying novel that blends memoir, fantasy, and political allegory into a surreal landscape that's as challenging as it is captivating.
DONNAVILLE isn't just a story, it's a place and a state of mind. It's a bold exploration of identity, resistance, and the power of storytelling itself. We sat down with Donna to discuss the themes of DONNAVILLE, the creative process behind it, and the way she uses her signature, raw, honest voice to shape a world that's both deeply intimate and universally relatable. This episode also includes 3 excerpts from DONNAVILLE, read by Donna Minkowitz herself.
Thank you for joining us, Donna. It's really good to have you back on the show. For those who don't know who you are, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, it's so great to be back with you guys, first of all. I've been a writer for about 40 years. I started out in journalism, although I had also done some poetry. And I started as a young writer at the Village Voice. It was like the first alternative weekly. Started in New York in the 60s. And back then, all newspapers were written in this very objective and boring prose. And the Village Voice was really the first place in the country that was letting journalists be more individual and political and not pretend to be objective. And you can even get kind of funky and creative in your writing. And I was really excited to be working there. I was one of the first journalists at the paper covering the LGBTQ community in a serious way. And in fact, back then, it was one of the first journalists at any paper, really, because there was so little coverage. And I covered queer politics and culture from the late 80s through the mid-90s. Then I left the paper and I wrote 2 memoirs. The first was called Ferocious Romance, and it was about covering the anti-gay Christian right as a lesbian journalist. And it was a lot about discovering that even though I feared and hated them, and of course there was a lot to fear from them, I also had a lot of things in common with them, which were not easy to look at, a little hard to find out. The book is kind of about how intimate our enemies can be, how intimate they can feel. It would be hard to do that book now because the Christian right actually has gotten a lot scarier as the whole right wing in our country has gotten scarier. But the book was also about, hey, their solutions are terrible, but some of the things they think are problems, I also think are problems. Like, we're all encouraged just to be in this meaningless culture that tells us to buy things and consume all the time. Like, can't we have some meaning? But, they want the meaning to be fundamentalist police station. And that's not the meaning I want. Anyway, my second memoir, Growing Up Golem, is mainly about my life from my 20s to around 40. It's about how hard life was for me as a young person. And I think for many of us, because we're figuring out what to do with the hand we were dealt and who we became in our childhood as a result of the houses we grew up in. Anyway, at the same time, I was continuing to do journalism. And after Trump got elected, I returned to political reporting, this time about the white supremacist movement, some of it undercover, going back to my undercover work on the Christian right.
Speaking about kind of the funky and creative writing that you've done in the past, and the 2 books you just mentioned, you're talking to us because you've written something else.
Yes, I've written my first novel called DONNAVILLE, and it has things in common with the themes of the first 2 books, but it's totally different from anything else I've ever written.
What inspired DONNAVILLE? How does it reflect the themes in your book?
Well, I've been wanting to write a novel for quite a while. And first, I thought it was going to be about the relationship between my wife and me, and how we, like any relationship, we had some issues, but how we really worked on them together. But anyway, my wife is a very private person and she put the kibosh on that. So I decided, okay, I'd write a book that, just about me, be about my struggles, my journey. But I wasn't sure if it would be a memoir or a novel, although I did want it to be symbolic and related to myth, because that's the kind of writing that I really like to do these days. And around this time, right before the pandemic, we were watching on TV this show. I don't know if you're familiar with Outlander. It's sort of a time travel, supernatural, historical romance set in Scotland in the 18th century. Early on in the show, the main character's husband is brutally tortured by this English captain because the husband's a rebel. And the show really emphasizes torture, how important torturing people is to this dude, how much he loves it, which is an odd thing. The show truly establishes how obsessed the captain is by torture, but the show also really expects us to be titillated by it, which is kind of, I think, how our culture thinks about violence and trauma in general. It's like obsessive and also titillated. So like watching this made me think about how there seems to be a torture chamber in my brain. You guys know the expression, none of us are free till all of us are free. So that makes me think of how I think we're all affected by things that happen in the world, like torture and just the threat of violence, because potentially there's something out there that could be done to us that's very terrifying like that. So I think the existence of things like torture keeps us all unfree. I mean, for me personally, torture around the world has always had a very vivid reality. I've done some activism against it, written some about it. I think torture is the most evil act that anyone could do. I'm very frightened of it. At the same time, before the pandemic, I began doing this new kind of therapy called drama therapy. I had a new therapist who's a drama therapist. It was much more creative and fun than any other kind of therapy I'd done. And I've been really exploring the most critical part of myself, which kind of likes to put the other parts of me in a dungeon. And this part, the critical part, thinks it's helping. It thinks it's like correcting these parts, taking care of them, making them better, but it's actually causing me incredible pain. So these first two characters, they became two characters in the book, came to me first in drama therapy. First, a jailer, who's this critical part. And then I knew someone in me, there was a person in a dungeon, someone who was stuck in a dungeon and was being hurt there. And that person wound up being the character called the child, who's a little girl. So they were the first two characters, the jailer and the child. And the rest developed from there.
Because this is your mind, your life, what sort of experiences influenced the creation of this book? Why did you feel you had to write it?
Yeah, well, I've been very open in my other writing about the fact that I experienced physical abuse as a child. And the repercussions of it is that I really had to experiment to figure out a way to take care of myself when I got to adulthood, because the models that I had for nurturing and taking care of were very problematic ones. Both my parents actually combined, real nurturing, sometimes really good nurturing, with genuine abuse, which is not often talked about, how these things can be combined. And that can make nurturing itself very scary. Be mean to me, fine, hurt me, ignore me. Like, this is how a lot of us are in our relationships. But be kind to me, be nice to me, treat me as though I'm important. I can't take that because it feels too vulnerable. A lot about what this book is the story of is how finding it so hard to accept nurturing as an adult, how I was afraid of it, both taking care of myself in that way and letting myself being taken care of by others, and towards the process of how I was able to do that. It's just told in novel form because almost all the characters are parts of me.
How did you go about developing the characters' personalities and their story arcs?
When I talk about figuring out how to nurture myself, that's a lot what the character of the Divine Mother is doing there. So she's a goddess, but she also represents the kind of nurturing, especially like motherly or feminine nurturing that I've been afraid of all my life, which is pretty ironic because I'm a lesbian and my partner, who's a woman, is very nurturing. So you'll see in the book there are parts of Donnaville that are completely closed off to the Divine Mother. They're terrified of her and they have this sort of magic in place to bar her from entering. And that's that fear of letting this kind of feminine nurturing in. Some of the characters are terrified of the Divine Mother. There's also characters like the Harlequin who are deeply misogynist. He's very suspicious of the Divine Mother. Sometimes he finds her disgusting. And the plot of Donnaville is a lot about how they stop finding her disgusting or stop trying to block her out. And then in terms of some of the other characters' personalities and arcs, very quickly there came to me this character called the Harlequin, who's kind of the jailer's opposite. So the jailer doesn't only cause pain, he also feels a lot of pain. In fact, he's in constant pain for the most part. And he also has a strong sense of duty, and he's always beating himself up for not doing enough of his duty. And the Harlequin is a total opposite. He doesn't feel any pain. In fact, there's something kind of druggy about him. He loves pleasure and he loves to help the other citizens in Donnaville escape their problems, by kind of enclosing them in these fantastic orbits of pleasure. And it's all very temporary, of course, and they don't really solve their problems. And the Harlequin also has absolutely no shame, has no sexual shame. The jailer has lots of shame, including sexual shame. He sees himself as an ugly old man who no one could ever be attracted to or even like. And the Harlequin thinks he's absolutely beautiful and sexy. He has an incredible confidence he can bring to everything. So they really are two sides of the same coin. The task with each of these characters was to make each of them more like the other. The Harlequin has no conception of duty. The jailer only knows duty, and he's terrified of enjoyment or personal happiness. So the problem with these two characters is that they inhabit these really rigid poles and they need to become more like each other. And the two characters do really reflect a basic struggle in me. I have a really strong sense of moral obligation, but then there's another part of me that chafes against it and feels rebellious. Like, what do you mean I have a duty to do X, Y, or Z? Like, this especially comes up for me with like activism. You need to go do this. And it's like, no, I want to have fun or I want to rest or, whatever. But at the same time, the Harlequin, not only doesn't he feel that pressure, he's really a rogue in a lot of ways. Sometimes an asshole, actually. He thinks it's okay to lie to people. He's terrified of being committed to anyone, and that really does reflect my younger self in many ways. And what he needs is to be truthful with people, to work at not just escape, this sort of magical, like, oh, if I don't think about what's actually going on here, the city has a terrible prison, that's fine. We'll just, not think about it and do pleasurable things. But he really needs to learn how to face things and care about people and let people care about him. This is a first-person piece in the jailer's voice. Oh, yes, I have always wanted to bake, not just bread, but cakes, things that could delight me and my mother, things that if you set them on the table could delight neighbors and all sorts of people you might meet, make them like me for once. My mother's friend made this cake with honey caramelized almonds on top. She served it to us with tea in a little china set. I haven't really made anyone tea before this lady right now. That was so nice, and it made me remember how I used to like women. So long ago, when I was quite young, it was always my favorite pastime when my mother took me over to other women's houses so they could have coffee, and I would play on the floor. I would look up at their legs under the table, blushing bright. They seemed quite alive, and their conversation so vivid as well. Men didn't talk that way. Magna is lovely. No one so nice has ever been in my rooms, it is sad to say. She's like a tall rose. I longed for women when I was younger, too, and of course I also pined for men, but I haven't longed for anyone in that way in so many years, other than those paler, barer itchings to cut into people or to make them wish they died before they ever came to me.
Yeah, no, those are interesting character arcs. I'm curious about what is the duty that the jailer really feels?
Well, I know it's counterintuitive because it's the duty to do this terrible thing and, imprison and torture, like the other parts of Donna or the other residents of Donnaville, some of them. I mean, the reason he thinks he needs to do this is he thinks this is how to take care of the city. He thinks this is care. Now we use that word for both care that parents might give children and care that government should provide to communities. I learned a long time ago that unfortunately, the part in me that thought it was taking care of me, like the parental part, it didn't understand any other way to do that but be really critical and really torture me. But so, yeah, the jailer, like a bunch of torturers in history, thinks he's doing the right thing.
Kind of reminds me of Aunt Lydia from The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people who think they're doing the right thing can be the most horrifying. I mean, the most important person who he's doing this stuff to is the child, this little 8-year-old girl, who's been given almost no care throughout her life. And I took that girl from a short story that a lot of science fiction readers know, which is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin. She imagines this utopia, and it's not this city called Omelas. And it's not just a political utopia, like everyone there literally is happy all the time and they treat each other really, really. And then it's like, what is this based on? It's based on keeping one little child horribly, neglected, not taken care of, and also abused in this prison, this naked child who has not been fed well, not been spoken to, not given education or language or social contact. And the idea is many people, when they think about utopias or they think about, doing good, they let it depend on, just this one person is going to be subject to the terrible torment and that will be okay. So that's a lot about where the idea of the child in the prison came from and how the jailer thinks he's saving Donnaville, keeping Donnaville healthy by harming the child. The child, still wearing Bobby's purple silk shirt as a kind of tunic or dress, walks through the streets in wonder. It is still daylight, and office workers are strolling, enjoying the beauty of the late afternoon sun on the old office buildings, the storefronts, the little trees planted only recently in the business district. The girl is amazed at the golden light. Inside a Staples, there is a water fountain, and she drinks for a long time. There is vomit on her feet from her long run through the jail, and she tries to wash it off in the Staples bathroom, but she is new to washing, and there are some green bits left. And then, a little later, the child has suddenly become aware of how much she smells, despite washing in the Staples bathroom. People move away from her in the park on crowded streets. I'm lonely. People don't like me. I smell like a hamster cage. But hunger drives her. She identifies with the animals she sees, the pigeons and the park rats, as she scavenges for pieces of abandoned sandwiches and fruit. Perhaps she can build a house out of what other people throw away, out of orange peels and plastic water bottles, walnut shells and sailing yogurt lids.
That's a philosophy, like utilitarian.
Yeah.
You do one thing because it's for the greater good.
The end justifies the means. Getting back to torture, that's why I think torture is never justified for any reason. Some people think, well, what if it's a really bad person and they could give you information that could stop someone from, doing some other bad thing? My answer is no. There are some things that are, never justified to do to anyone, and they debase us. They make us all less human when we consider doing things like that.
DONNAVILLE seems to have a really unique narrative voice, and it's really different than a lot of books that we've read in recent years. So, how did you choose the style and the tone for the book?
A lot of the writing in DONNAVILLE combines the styles that I most like to work in. Very sensual, lyrical, like I did in some of my food writing, and sexy, but also emotional and sometimes very sharp and bleak, but also funny at times. It's kind of how I most like to write. The vampires are interested in the child. Her inner nature draws them, smelling of bergamot. In fact, the child would be pretty easy to find at this moment if the vampires could rip themselves away from the blood sources much closer to them. The girl is in an open meadow in a large park in the north-central west of DONNAVILLE. There, in a garbage can near the playground, she finds a foil sack with a coating of Cheeto dust and a baggie with some funky carrot sticks. She fights a pigeon for a whole half of an abandoned meatball hero and wins, using her torn-off shirt to strike against its beak. Some of the park moms take in her physical stink and bare feet and dive for their phones to call social services. But one of their friends, an artist mom with messy hair and slightly stained clothes, wards them off, a finger on her lips. She walks over to the child very slowly, like an experienced conservation veterinarian approaching a wolf. Stopping 3 feet away, she faces the girl and shouts, "Do you have a mommy?" The child runs. She avoids playgrounds after that when people are in them. But late that night, she washes herself and her shirt in the abandoned plaza fountain using a bar of soap she stole from the chambermaid's cart at the Midtown Days Inn. She still looks funny, and the silk shirt takes many days to dry, but she doesn't smell anymore. The child consults a map she stole from a convenience store. According to the laminated, brightly colored tourist map, on the western edge of DONNAVILLE, there is a wild area called Rubus fruticosus, covered with blackberry vines and rose bushes. Few visit Rubus because of the razor-sharp thorns in the bramble, the map says. The child thinks it sounds promising. She could eat the blackberries and nobody would bother her. She wants to eat berries and to see a rose.
The book DONNAVILLE combines fiction and obviously some bits of autobiography and just things that you've experienced. So how did you blend those? And was there any difficulty in trying to blend those together?
I initially was going to call this book a memoir, but then I realized that if I called it that, people would be expecting a very different book because people expect memoirs to be very straightforward and literal. And this book is about a bunch of people who do not literally exist, who are different parts of me. Also there's a flying horse. But I did want to say there's been this revolution happening in the memoir writing community in the past 20 years that I really love, where a lot of us no longer think we have to be absolutely straightforward and literal, but we can use metaphors and myth and symbolism and other fictional techniques. We don't have to let fiction writers have all the fun just because we're writing about our actual lives. Because I've always hated the idea that just because something is true, that you don't get to be really creative about it. You can make it into a true work of art. So for me, blending autobiography and fiction let me have the best of both worlds. And I think making it a novel also let me keep a lot of mystery in the book, where I didn't have to spell everything out. I found that very satisfying. There's something to me about mystery that makes a work more beautiful, more haunting, and maybe easier for everyone else to see themselves in the story.
Yeah, I wonder if the shift has been happening in the memoir writing world because it can be jarring to write about your own life, sometimes traumatic. And if you're adding creativity into it, is that easier in some way?
Yeah, definitely. It is easier. There's something about trauma. Judith Herman talked about in her book called Trauma and Memory. There's something about it that makes us resist wanting to read it, wanting to think about it. So memoirs that are sort of straight trauma, people have a hard time with them often because, they're just so hard to read. And it's like, no, don't want to think about this. Bye. But so writing about it in a more fictional way, like Emily Dickinson said, tell all the truth, but tell it slant, makes it better, I think, for both writer and reader, where it can be like a fairy tale, and in fairy tales, like in the container of a story, we're able to hear about the wolf eating people. I think that makes it easier.
No, I was going to say, because remember a few days ago, I think we discussed about fiction writing versus nonfiction. Like, so if I write something creatively, it's 90% of the time it's going to be fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can write creatively for nonfiction as well. But I think for me, just pulling something deep from within myself, it's going to be a darker side of fiction. And it's going to have those elements of truth. It's going to bring my personal experiences. Then that's how I express them. Because I've never thought about memoir writing as anything other than just being truthful and just, like you said, like pretty much, your experiences and not, I haven't thought about adding any element of fiction to memoirs. Never been a thought. So it's interesting that that's where memoir writing is going.
I mean, so like, I think even memoirs that are straightforwardly written, they also are very much shaped, and made into a story. At least the good ones are. So there is an element of art to it, even if it doesn't break into fiction. Like you choose what you're going to emphasize. I mean, I think you have to choose because otherwise it would be incredibly boring. Then I woke up and then I went to the bathroom.
Of course.
So of course it's always like like you're telling a very particular story. Yeah, I'm thrilled that memoir is going in that direction. I think a lot of us nonfiction writers are becoming aware that story is a lot of what makes human minds work. Story has a certain shape, and it's not actually the literal way that things happen. Like they don't happen in that neat, structured way. But to get across to other human beings and have people get excited about it and like really take it in, it needs to be in the form of a story.
That makes sense.
Because, our lives are all stories in some ways, right? They affect how we experience the world and how we even write about it. Even like fantasy writers are using some of their own personal lives because you can't just come up with this.
I mean, people come up with weird things, but you always incorporate something about your own experiences into the writing. I mean, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, there's always a story. That's the only way. What writing is, you're telling a story, essentially. And you're creative, either way.
Yeah, and I love how some fantasy and science fiction writers, use that form to tell stories about our world, like a lot of political stories that are easier to tell that way than if it were set in a contemporary time, like Ursula Le Guin writing about anarchism. What would an anarchist society be like?
About the stories we're just kind of talking about, how do the stories in Donnaville tie into reality or into your actual life?
One thing is my wife is in the book. She and there's a tourist character named Hylas. They are really the only people in the book who are not parts of me. Anyway, she's in the book. It's really her, even though I call her by a different name. Donnaville is on some level about how I was able to develop a love relationship, and a wonderful one at that, when I never thought I was going to be able to do that. I mean, it's always what I wanted the most from when I was very young. And I thought I wouldn't be able to do it, not a real one or a good one or one that lasted a long time. So it's a lot about that process. And then the other way the stories in Donnaville tie into my actual life is, so there's all these parent figures. Divine Mother, she's a parent as well as a goddess. And then the jailer is called Daddy by the child, and by one other character too, a character called Sloppy, who's a prisoner. So these two parental figures. Writing the book, it was also a lot a way for me to recuperate my parents in fiction. And my parents are both dead now, but it's been in recent years that I've been able to really connect with them in a lot of ways and think about the good parts in them. And because they did have good parts, and kind of recuperate them. And in Donnaville, the novel, the good parts of them, both of them, are also recuperated in fiction.
There's something really unique about the cover of the book, which is kind of a key to understanding Donnaville. It's essentially a map of Donnaville. And curious of, how you came up with the idea of a map and the names and locations of the places on the map.
Well, I'm really glad you asked me about the map because I love it. So I love fantasy novels. Most fantasy novels have a map, and I wanted a map when I began seeing how Donnaville would take shape. So I very much wanted to base the geography of Donnaville on the city I live in. It's a tiny city called Beacon, New York, in the Hudson Valley. It's this tiny city in this area that has lots of wilderness and small towns and natural beauty and farms. And I feel more at home in Beacon than any other place I've ever lived. I've lived in New York for most of my life and really identified as a New Yorker. I mean, so one reason I wanted to base the map of Donnaville on Beacon is I feel very identified with Beacon, so it felt right to me. Another reason is in Beacon, mountains and a river are very sort of important geographic features. And I wanted those because I think they have a lot of mythic or symbolic resonance. And then another thing is that Beacon has a lot of contradictory aspects, and Donnaville does too. It's an urban environment with this really important prison. Beacon also has a prison that everybody knows about and very few people talk about. It's a pretty scary prison, Fishkill Correctional Facility, but it's actually based in Beacon, not Fishkill. Donnaville has factories. It's in this bucolic setting, but it has factories, some of which pollute. It has a lot of crime and poverty. It has a lot of unhoused people. But it also has this great natural beauty of the river and the mountains, and there's a farm. Beacon also, until very recently, was a factory town. It was not very bucolic, except for the mountains and the river. Like I said, it has this prison, and it had a lot of crime and a lot of poverty. But Donnaville also has people who care, people who are trying to help each other. Beacon does too. Community spirit is something I love the most about Beacon, and how kind people are. Kind of the point when I made the map is that in a person, like in a lot of cities, there can be a lot of contradictory things at once. I am a whole, I'm a totality, but I'm not all one thing. I wanted there to be a lot of unhoused people in Donnaville. So there's two areas on the map that particularly indicate this. There's the tent city of the unhoused, which has some unhoused people who are very artistic, community-minded. And then there's Mala's storage facility. She rents out storage units to fellow unhoused people. And eventually she just lets them stay there, even if they don't pay. And where that comes from is the idea of an internal government. I say at one point that the government of Donnaville doesn't provide very good services to its citizens. All it has really is a terrible foster care system and an even worse criminal justice system. the idea is the internal government of Donnaville, at least at the outset, doesn't really know a lot about how to provide care to its citizens. And if a government in the real world treated its citizens the same way my internal government does me, I'd be out protesting it. I think another place they come from me is that my own father sometimes stayed in flop houses, which mostly don't exist anymore, but they were places, including in New York, that men with very little money, sometimes alcoholics, sometimes mentally ill could go. They were very, very sad places with very little privacy. Like men were in these little individual things with like wire mesh between them. They were typically on the Bowery. And my father was very bad at taking care of himself. And both my mother and my father, when they were alive, sometimes reminded me of unhoused people for a lot of different reasons. And connecting this to me, myself, the part of me that feels like I'm not taking very good care of myself. There are these parts inside me that have been wandering and don't have a home. So the book is a lot about how they get one.
I think that there's a lot that like people can identify with. And I think like for me, parts of me feel that way, even though I do have a home. There's still parts of me that are like, they're not complete because it's not like settled. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like everybody can kind of identify with that in some way.
When am I going to find this place of safety and security? If I could just talk about the Divine Mother for a second, because she's a goddess, but she is imperfect. I really wanted what I had to say about religion to be an important part of this book, because I have very strong religious feelings myself, but they're very untraditional. And one of the religions I like the most is Gnosticism, which was this heretical, sometimes Jewish or Christian religious system. And in Gnosticism, sometimes gods are imperfect. Like they might not be perfectly good, or they might not be perfectly powerful. And to me, that's really important. Like, I hate how, in mainstream religions, I think like humans get all the blame for evil in the world. And I always thought, why isn't some of the blame God's? I mean, like God put us in this situation. God set it up this way. Why isn't some of this God's fault? So I really wanted the Divine Mother, she is very good. She definitely means well, but she's not entirely good. She's very powerful, but she's not perfectly powerful. She can't do everything. In Donnaville, a significant plot point is she chooses to go through this certain trial at a certain point, after she realizes that she has wronged one of the characters, one of the residents in Donnaville. And, she also, she hasn't done great about protecting the city from suffering and evil. She's intended to, but she has not always done well. And so I wanted to put, like a god or goddess, like kind of on the hook for some of the things that go wrong. And so the trial that she undertakes, the things she goes through, it's kind of a way of taking responsibility, acknowledging her debt to all these human beings.
That's a really human way of seeing an entity, God. And I think maybe that's why most mainstream religions and most people who are religious don't have that view, because it's almost like, well, if God is like human, then what's the difference between them and us? They like to have that separation.
I guess that's interesting because, the understanding of like Gnosticism, I guess it kind of fits because it's not the view of the world around you, and God's is not what it seems to be. It's kind of the opposite in Gnosticism in terms of what people generally think of. And I think that's why it was so like heretical so long ago. It probably still would be. And then there are religions where, like Norse gods, for instance, like they're at the time, right, when there was a big religion, that living gods, and they're not perfect. And I think the same goes for Roman and Greek gods, somewhat not perfect. They make mistakes because they were living gods amongst the people, as to where, Judeo-Christian God is sort of the remote, not amongst the people kind of God. So it's the disconnect from daily life and religion.
That is really interesting. The gods in Donnaville are amongst the people. In some ways I wanted the Divine Mother to be like Aphrodite. She does get involved in affairs with some of the human beings in Donnaville, as the Greek gods and goddesses do. Just getting back to Gnosticism, in how the Gnostics talk about the Garden of Eden, to them, the snake is good, and the person called God in the main Bible is on the side of evil, telling us not to eat from the tree, not to become wise. And the serpent actually embodies something called the female spiritual principle, which is divine and wants to free us. And in Gnosticism, all the things God says, like, I'm a jealous God, and you can't have any other gods, and if you do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to hurt you. So in Gnosticism, that's all bad, as I think it should be. And there is kind of a deeper God, loves us and is trying to free us. And it's not the same as this mean God who just wants to be worshipped.
Just to go back to the map a little bit, are the map locations based on real places? Each location, I mean?
Yes, some of them definitely are. So even though the map is based, loosely on Beacon, a lot of the things from the map also come from Brooklyn, which is where I was born, where I, grew up, where I lived 50 years. So there's a Prospect Park in there, and I don't label it, but there's really also a Park Slope where I lived for 15 years. It's like labeled the gentrified neighborhood. And in the book, I just call some characters Park Slope moms, because that's what they are. There's also Grand Army Plaza in the book, which is a place in Brooklyn at the beginning of Prospect Park. Without giving too much away, I'll just say that there are some Nazis that arise at some point in the book, and they march at Grand Army Plaza. And I've made this boulevard, which in Donnaville, and the map of Donnaville, is called Minkowitz Boulevard, but it's this diagonal boulevard that kind of is Flatbush Avenue, which is a big Brooklyn Avenue that's, been part of my whole life from childhood. And some of the places are taken from Beacon, the residential neighborhood by the river, the Greenway by the river. Some other things also come from New York City, like the Graffiti Queer Bar, Midtown and Downtown, and, the art museums are kind of New York art museums. There is a queer pizza place in the novel that has a low white picket fence, and that comes from a queer pizza place in Provincetown. Oh, so I have to acknowledge the map maker, Brendan Lorber. He's a really talented man. He's also a poet, but these maps, he draws kind of imaginary maps connected to literature. Like, I think he has an Emily Dickinson map. He just did a Whitman map. He makes these fantastical maps that put on paper things from the writing of these authors, and they look like fantasy maps, which I love. They're very beautiful. So I looked for a fantasy map maker, and he was the best one I found. I'm so happy he worked with us. I wanted to mention one more thing on the map. In the very eastern part of Donnaville, there is something called the Bramble, which is this massive, basically bush of thorns. It's kind of like a blackberry patch. I researched blackberries, which seem to be connected to roses. They're all in the same family, and there's actually a lot of really interesting magical beliefs associated with brambles. if you go under one at certain times of year, you'll have good luck, or you'll be freed from all these dangers. So the bramble on the eastern end becomes an important element in the book. Eventually, the child starts trying to go there. And anyway, I love the bramble and the way that Brendan drew it. It's simultaneously, it has all these thorns. It's kind of threatening or dangerous, but it's also quite beautiful. And there's a rose in the middle of it. And the child wants to go there because, she wants to eat some blackberries and to see a rose.
I was actually going to ask about the bramble. That's funny. Because I'm noticing from looking at the map, there's a lot of boundaries, right? You have the bramble, you have the mountains. And then there's, river and water. So for the residents and the people in Donnaville, are they able to kind of get past these boundaries? Or are they kind of just completely closed off into Donnaville?
Do you know, I have not thought about that. Clearly, people can come in. There are a lot of tourists. Like, there's a big tourist economy in Donnaville, and one of the characters, Hylas, is a tourist who comes on a ship from a place called Upper Caspia that is not Donnaville, because he's a different person. He's not part of me. Toward the later part of the book, the Harlequin says something about himself visiting Upper Caspia. So yes, I guess people from Donnaville can go to other cities, which is, some of them do go to the Divine Mother's fortress in the clouds in the book, but that's not quite the same thing because that's both within and outside Donnaville. It's kind of not either or. And the metaphor, I think, is, getting to know other people, not just staying in your own little city state, but going and exploring other people's too.
Yeah, I think it's about obviously exploring yourself, but then jumping outside of that and being able to experience something else.
Yeah, the Harlequin near the beginning of the novel, someone offers him a drink, kind of a magic drink, and he drinks it. And I don't know if it's psychedelic or what, but a sunflower starts talking to him. And the Harlequin knows that something's kind of wrong. Things aren't really working for him in the same way that they always do. And the sunflower says, don't you ever want to get to know someone who's not you? He decides to give it a try.
That is insanely creative. I on a level that how do you come up with some of these things? They're fantastic.
Thank you. I just had fun. It was really great to let myself have fun and explore where these characters led me. And, things started coming out of their mouths and I was like, what? Why are you saying that? But it was really fun to let that happen. And
Donna, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Amazing. It is a great conversation about the book and about writing in general. It's great.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be back with you too. I appreciate it a lot.
It was great having you. Thank you. We'd like to thank Donna for being on the show today. Donna is a writer of fantasy, memoir, and journalism, and the author of Donnaville. Donna has crafted a world that not only draws us in, but challenges the very boundaries of what fiction can be.
It's a book that intertwines personal experience with the surreal and the complexities of selfhood, love, and rebellion. Donnaville is out now, so go pick it up at your favorite bookstore. We'll also have links to it in the episode's show notes.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can find us on X, Threads, Instagram, and TikTok. And listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.